Hello students, welcome to this lesson on psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic criticism. What does psychoanalysis do? Let me first offer you a quick summary. Psychoanalysis is the study of the mind, of the way the mind works, of dreams, nightmares, anxieties, paranoias and fears. Our objective here is to examine psychoanalysis as a discipline, but also to see how psychoanalysis works as a form of critical practice through which we read texts, whether they are literary or art. The focus here is of course critical work and not so much as psychoanalytic practice in psychiatric clinics. Psychoanalysis, like I said, pays attention to the life of the mind, how the mind works, how its dreams reflect something deeper. Psychoanalysis is interested in what gets repressed, a technical term which I will elaborate in a bit. It talks about taboos, what the mind prohibits, but what the mind also retains in a different format. How do these things that are repressed come out in the form of dreams? Psychoanalysis is interested in questions of identity that are formed in our minds about ourselves. Psychoanalysis is also interested in how literary texts, novels and plays appeal to us, but also code certain anxieties, desires and prohibited desires in particular. For example, psychoanalysis is interested in how sexuality and sexual desires are kept underneath the surface in cultural and literary texts as they are kept hidden within our own minds. Psychoanalysis finds its origins primarily in the theories of Sigmund Freud, a 19th century thinker whose influence has, it has been said, been on par with Charles Darwin and Karl Marx as one of the three principal figures who influenced the way we think in the 20th century. Freud argued that the human psyche, or the structure of our mind, has three significant components. The first is the ego. The ego is the conscious mind. It is what we work with, it is what we are most aware of, it's the source of all our decision making, our rational thought processes. In other words, it's the most obvious component of our mind and its workings. Then there is something called the superego, which Freud identifies with our conscience. The conscience is drawn from social settings and cultural codes, essentially the society in which we live, the family within which we stay and work and think. It influences the way we make our decisions in the conscious mind. But the most interesting component of the human psyche in Freudian theory of psychoanalysis is the id. The id is the unconscious. The unconscious is a very peculiar thing. The unconscious is a place into which all our anxieties, our desires, especially those desires that we can't talk about in public, are pushed. The id is the forbidden area. The unconscious is the place where all those nasty things and desires, forbidden, suppressed, are put. This process of pushing everything that is forbidden, that is unacceptable culturally, is called repression. So repression is the process through which all the desires that are prohibited, all the taboos that are unacceptable socially and culturally are placed. Freud argued that this unconscious plays a very important role in our lives. We will come to that in a bit. Freud also argued that all human life is run by two clear principles. One is the pleasure principle, which says all effort of human beings is to maximize pleasure. A corollary to that, to reduce pain. That is, the pleasure principle argues that humanity strives to increase what it obtains as pleasure. The second principle is called the reality principle. The reality principle tells us all our pleasures cannot be attained. The reality principle tells us that certain kinds of pleasure are forbidden. What gets forbidden as pleasure is of course consigned to the unconscious by a process we have already referred to as repression. Right? That is roughly the scheme with which psychoanalytic criticism begins and works with, and we will develop these as we go along. A second significant model of the psychoanalytic critical practice comes from Freud's one-time collaborator. Carl Gustav Jung, C.G. Jung, was a long-time Freud supporter, fellow thinker, and then they separated because they thought very differently about things within psychoanalysis. Jung argued that all our drives, our energies, our principles could be pushed and channelized into something akin to it. What Jung was proposing was that our desires possess a certain social influence, what we do with it. More importantly, Jung was very clear that our self, our identity is also influenced by social norms. Now, this is important. For Freud, everything vested was rooted in individual psychological states. Jung argued, on the other hand, that what we have repressed, put inside our minds or retained in our ego, to go back to the three-part distinction Freud makes of the human psyche, could be traced to what he called primordial images. These primordial images, which we carry within our minds, are drawn from the cultural context in which we live. What Jung was talking about was that a society or a culture at a period of time shares certain common fears, common anxieties, and common desires. He referred to, for example, the persistence of myth and legend in what we do and what we think. He referred to this as the collective unconscious, a term that has become exceedingly popular, and it is on par perhaps with Freud's terminology of the unconscious of the id and others. What Jung was proposing was that myths and legends, our folklore, offer us a set of images, offer us a set of icons and symbols which influence our individual psyches. Now, please understand this. Jung was talking about an entire society's set of images from which individuals draw. It's like a large reservoir or pool of images from which individual dreams come. He called them archetypes. Archetypes are icons that we all share and understand, and which influence individuals. Now, the difference here is Jung was very clear that the social had something to do with the individual. Freud's focus remained the individual right till the end of his thinking. It's only in one of his last books on civilization, the title is very interesting, Civilization and its Discontents, that Freud talks about something more collective. But for him, most of the neurosis remained within the individual. Jung was taking it on a different route altogether. These theories emerged from roughly the 1880s through the 1920s. But by the time 1930s comes along, a new thinker appears on the horizon of psychoanalytic practice and psychoanalytic thought. And this is the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Lacan announced a back to Freud movement. Disillusioned with contemporary psychoanalysis, he argued that Freudian theory, when combined with linguistics, produces a whole new range of interpretive schemes. What Lacan does is very interesting and has been called very often now structuralist psychoanalysis. Lacan was interested in theories of identity, and he, like Freud, organized identity around three principal processes or three stages. And this module on structuralist psychoanalysis and identity will look at Lacan's three-part model. The first stage in identity formation is the imaginary, what Lacan calls the imaginary. And his example is, when the child looks into the mirror, looks at the mirror and sees his reflection in it, the boy, the child, does not see a distinction between his physical body and the image he perceives in the mirror. That is, the boy does not see a distinction between himself and his reflection. The imaginary is the familiarity and the similarity the boy believes. And I'm using the word boy because Lacan is mostly interested in boy children. There is very little that he has done with girl children. The boy looks at the mirror, sees the reflection, and believes that what he sees there is the same as this. The image, the reflection, and his flesh and blood condition are the same. Now, this is what he refers to as a mirror stage. In the mirror stage, the boy, the child, looking into the mirror, sees himself as complete, as being at one with what he is seeing in the mirror. It's important that for Lacan, the mirror stage is more or less the parallel, or is paralleled by the relationship between the mother and the child. At this early stage, the child does not see a distinction between himself and the mother. I am part of the mother is part of me. I am this reflection, the reflection is a part of me. So, for the first stage, in the first stage of Lacanian psychoanalysis, the mirror stage, the boy is caught in something called the imaginary, where he imagines that this is the way identity works. Then comes the second stage. The second stage is what Lacan calls the symbolic. In the symbolic, the child acquires a language. What does that mean? The child suddenly is told, this is you, this is mother, this is father. He gets a name for each identity. This is me, this is not me. This is not me. For the first time, the child is told, you are you, and that is mother, and this is father. You are not your mother. Please remember, in the first stage, the child believes he and the mother, he and the reflection are the same. In the second stage, he is told they are different. The symbolic marks a radical reversal in the child's mind about his identity, where for the first time, different names, different pronouns, I, them, me, she, constitutes not just linguistic difference, but identity difference. Oh, says the boy, this is me, that is not me. This is I, that is mother. So the symbolic is the stage at which identity begins to form in a separate unit. In the first stage, the child and the imagined reflection are the same. The child and the mother are the same. In the second stage of the symbolic, through the arrival of language, the boy says, that is not me. So the first time in which the boy recognizes the not me is a step towards the formation of a separate identity. The third stage is what Lacan calls the real. This is the order which both the imaginary and the symbolic try to control. The first stage gave him the sense of similarity. The second stage gave him the principle of difference, of otherness, that is not me. The third stage in the real, these two conflicts have to be resolved, where the child has to recognize that identities are different. Lacan also argues that all our unconscious desires are structured like a language. It's based on the principle of desire. It is also based on the principle of difference. Feminist versions of psychoanalysis have focused on issues of identity, the woman's sexuality, the structure of the family, and the mother-daughter relationship. A crucial book in this domain was Nancy Chodorow's The Reproduction of Mothering. Chodorow made a very important assessment and argument. The daughter is seen by the mother as her own double, as her extension. Therefore, the daughter does not develop a separate sense of significant difference or identity because she is treated as an extension of the mother. What Chodorow calls weak ego boundaries are to do with this sense of doubling or of extension, whereby there is no autonomy. Do recall here what I have said about Lacan's second stage, where the child discovers difference. That in the mirror is a reflection, this is me. That is mother, this is me. Chodorow argues that for daughters, this sense of me develops very late in life because they are constantly seen as extending the mother's work. And Chodorow talks about the fact that girls from a very young age are taught principles of care and compassion, where they are trained to look after people, younger siblings, younger people in the house, because that constitutes an important moment in the formation of identity. Like the mother, the daughter continues the system of care and compassion. There is no autonomy from the mothers for the girl child. For Chodorov, the Oedipal complex, to which I shall come in a minute, the relationship between the father and the daughter is very different. Boys discover their gender through their independence. Girls discover their gender through mutuality. This is the major move that Chodorov makes. A later critic is Jacqueline Rose. Jacqueline Rose argues in a major work on Lacan, but also later works like Sexuality in the Field of Vision, that imposed identities like the feminine or the woman fail. She suggests that social processes that seek to impose this identity often meet resistance. Jacqueline Rose has an important advancement of the Lacanian theory. She argues that the unconscious is the place where the resistance to identity begins. The unconscious is the place where alternative identities are crafted, and therefore socially imposed identities do not always work very well. Jacqueline Rose also made a very important advancement over predecessor theories by arguing that there is no such thing as a unified or coherent feminine subjectivity. Feminine subjectivity is always fragmented and fractured. As you can see, in all these models, what we are looking at is an advancement of Freudian theory into various components. Feminist psychoanalysis, which argues for a specific reading of Freud from the perspective of gender and for looking at, say, mother-daughter relationships or the gendered relationships in a society. Lacan takes it elsewhere by associating Freudian theory and putting it alongside language and linguistics. Mid-70s and early 80s, like in books such as Agon, A Map of Misreading and The Anxiety of Influence, Harold Bloom articulated a theory of literature which he adapted from psychoanalytic theories. Let's go here to a specific moment within Freud in order to understand this. Freud's famous theory of the Oedipal complex drew from literature, specifically Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex, in which the son kills the father and marries the mother, though he doesn't know that she is the mother. This story becomes a model for what Freud argued is the Oedipal complex that all boys suffer from. The Oedipal complex is the fascination and desire of the boy for his mother. And this desire for the mother is what is prohibited by the father. For Freud, this is a very important moment. What he proposes here is not only is there desire, there is the desire and its prohibition, that you cannot desire mother. This third stage, desire, the prohibition of desire, the third stage is the role of the father, where the father steps in as a figure of authority. The father is the tyrannical man who makes a case that this is not possible, that this desire is taboo, that this desire must be treated as a sin. So, in the Oedipal complex from Freudian theory, the father always appears as a tyrannical authoritarian figure, a disciplinarian who prohibits desire. This is the point at which Harold Bloom takes off with his criticism and his model of literature. Bloom argues that all poets suffer from an anxiety of influence. What is this anxiety of influence? Every poet believes that predecessor poets have been great, that they have always already written the big themes in poetry. They have done the experiments with language and they have conveyed what they hope to convey. That is, all poets believe that traditional literary figures have already done what they set out to do. The anxiety of influence is the worry, is the anxiety that there is nothing new you can do because your predecessor poets have already done so. The predecessor poet therefore functions as some kind of a father figure who can only stand there as a figure of authority, who stands there as a disciplinarian, and who stands there adjudicating and deciding what you as the next poet or son will do. Now, the younger poet therefore suffers from an anxiety that he might be punished by his father. More importantly, the younger poet is anxious that there is nothing he can really do which is significant or new because the father has already done it. Therefore, the younger poet in Harold Bloom's model can only set out to do anything new by rereading the traditionals, by rereading the predecessor poet, by rereading the father figure. Bloom argues this is a misreading, what he calls a misreading. It's not wrong reading, it's a rereading with a specific intention and purpose. The misreading is the process through which the younger poet comes to terms with, negotiates with the more powerful, authoritarian, traditional father figure. Unless this influence is taken care of, unless this anxiety is alleviated, the younger poet cannot function. Misreading for Bloom is therefore some kind of a psychic defense against the father, and he has several models of this. The poet who does not come to terms with this is a weak poet. The poet who is able to negotiate his predecessor father figure poet is a strong poet. These are terms that Bloom himself uses. So if you look very carefully at what Bloom is saying, Bloom is proposing that the father's influence must be negotiated, and until such time as the father's influence is dealt with, negotiated and put away at the back of your mind, the younger poet cannot function. The misreading process that he talks about is in a sense a reworking of the Oedipal complex. Remember, in the Oedipal complex, the son has to kill the father and then move on. The son has to do away with the father in order to become his own man, in order to attain identity. What Bloom is saying is the younger poet constantly writes under the shadow of the father poet. Till such time as you erase the father figure, there is no hope for the younger poet. So it's an interesting model of psychoanalytic criticism. It has had its influence in very major works of literary critical texts through the 80s and 90s. To go back to the point I've just made, Freud's Oedipal complex emerged from his reading of Sophocles. The ancient Greek playwright whose play Oedipus Rex gives him the idea for the Oedipal complex. In a sense, therefore, all major psychoanalytic theory encompassed in the Oedipal complex argument made by Freud comes from literature. Therefore, psychoanalytic criticism seems to have a natural existence within literary criticism. What does psychoanalytic criticism do? I have a brief list for you to think about. Literary criticism of the psychoanalytic variety looks at images of authority, father figures, church wardens, prison wardens, dictators, kings. All images of authority stand in for the father figure. It looks at the theme of taboo and transgression, of unacceptable sexual relations, whether it's queer, incest, or of any other kind. It sees these expressions of taboo and transgression as part of the repressive process. That's the third theme, that after looking at taboo, you see the taboo as an expression of a cultural condition. Literature talks about certain taboos because real life prohibits talking about those taboos. It is only within the domain of literature that these things can actually be talked about. Therefore, and this is important, literature becomes the mechanism through which unconscious desires of the individual or of the society can actually be expressed. It occurs in masked forms, and this is important. We are not arguing that literature always talks about forbidden desire. No, that's not what we are saying. What psychoanalytic criticism does is to show how certain themes within literature mask actual repressed desires. Okay? Now, it seeks to understand the sexual foundations of all repression, where it sees desire and sexual desire specifically as something the social order does not want to talk about. So desire is something that culture does not want expressed. It pretends it doesn't exist. Psychoanalysis reads literary texts as encoding this kind of prohibited desire. Finally, psychoanalytic criticism unravels the structure of the unconscious. It looks at something in a particular image, in a particular film shot or a theme, as talking about, in indirect ways, the repressed moments of the unconscious. So what does psychoanalytic criticism then do? Let me wind up with a quick summary of what we have looked at so far. Freudian theory, which is where psychoanalysis finds its origins, first looks at the three components of the human psyche: the ego, the superego, and the id. It talks about how certain kinds of desires which are prohibited are pushed into the unconscious, a process it identifies as repression. Feminist psychoanalysis uses these theories to talk about how identity is formed in the woman, the relationship between mother and daughter, which extends the daughter's identity, or which makes the daughter's identity an extension of the mother's. We looked at Lacan's theory of psychoanalysis, which builds on a link between psychoanalytic theory in the Freudian sense and contemporary linguistics, Lacan writing in the 1930s. Finally, in the Harold Bloom model of psychoanalysis, we saw how Bloom's theory proposes that all poets suffer from a father anxiety, where the predecessor poet has already written what this younger poet wanted to do. And Bloom's theory proposes that until such time as the younger poet disposes of the ghost of the father, negotiates with the presence of the father, new creative work cannot happen. So psychoanalytic criticism looks at all literary and cultural practices as expressions of unconscious desires and anxieties. This model has been very influential. It has had its share of critics, especially because of its emphasis on repression and sexuality, and also because much of traditional psychoanalysis has been clearly marked as gender biased. Thank you.